Welcome to the sixth hearing of the Committee's inquiry into the planning system and the impacts of climate change on the environment and communities. I acknowledge the Dharawal people, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are meeting today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. I also acknowledge and pay my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. My name's Sue Higginson, I'm the chair of the committee. I ask everyone in the room to please turn their mobile phones to silent. Parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses in relation to the evidence they give today. However, it does not apply to what witnesses say outside of the hearing. I urge witnesses to be careful about making comments to the media or to others after completing their evidence. In addition, the Legislative Council has adopted rules to provide procedural fairness for inquiry participants. I encourage committee members and witnesses to be mindful of these procedures. Welcome and thank you for giving time to come and give evidence today. Could I please start by you stating your name, your position, title and swearing either an oath or an affirmation?
Thank you. My name is Srini Pillai. I'm the Program Manager for Heritage Ecology and Land Management at Gandangara Local Aboriginal Land Council. My affirmation is I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Pillai. Do you have an opening statement that you would like to make?
Yes.
Thank you.
Firstly, I'd like to table the documents I emailed this morning.
Thank you.
I do have supporting maps here.
Thank you.
Just a hard copy. Good day to all present, and my acknowledgement to the Dharawal people, to whom I pay my respects. As the custodians of the land, my respect to the elders past and present. Dr. Melissa Williams, the CEO, conveys her apologies for her absence due to personal reasons. GLALC is a statutory custodian over 6 LGAs. In 5 overdeveloped LGAs, GLALC struggles with consent authorities that approve developments on critically endangered Cumberland Plain woodland fragments, and yet they ironically publicise their endangered status on their websites. So our recommendations for the 5 are: stop all riparian developments, build in residential clusters and reforest land in between clusters with animal corridors, modify existing stormwater outlets to increase groundwater recharge, build roads with land bridges over and under for animals, include anthropological assessments in developments, legislate native lower mid-story vegetation in residential gardens, chip and track all domestic pets. In the 6th LGA, Sutherland, GLALC struggles to protect 1,161 hectares of carbon sequestrating vegetation in Heathcote from development dumping. We are 13 years into 45 years of development to the Tri-Metropolitan 2056 plan. However, there is no development waste management plan. An estimated 1,200 tonnes of development waste threatens the green heart of Sydney's future Tri-Metro area. Heathcote houses a precious genetic metapopulation of koala. For First People, it's a blessing just to see the unique identity of Australia preserved, which is not for sale. The recommendations from the Sutherland examples are: mobilise a state-driven regional multi-stakeholder program of works to clean up development waste, especially Heathcote Ridge, which is the target of illegal dumping. Develop a robust statewide development waste plan. Stipulate an environmental impact assessment prior to transfer of Crown lands to LALCs and ensure at least 5 annual cycles of restoration. create a statewide campaign to inform and educate New South Wales residents about national assets protection, including anthropology. Increase regulatory powers and resources to rangers and police to protect all national assets on Australian soils. State considerations include recognize First Peoples and their knowledge systems which hold unique information about environmental changes over time and are well placed to inform about environmental solutions, and demonstrate it by directly investing in ranger stations and eco-depots on open bushland. Assist our climate change program. Fund the Gilauk Keeping Place and Koala Sanctuary at Heathcote to protect and preserve culture and heritage. Fund co-created anthropological research projects with First Peoples, LELCs and universities. And in closing, climate change, regarding climate change. The dynamic, imbalanced super system is a circular system that development ought to mimic. State has ignored natural laws in the 45 years of planned development. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pillay, would it be possible to have a copy of your opening statement for Hansard? Are you able to provide them a copy of that statement?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We will just have a few questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
Could I just ask, how do you, at the moment, how does GLAC interact with the decision makers that are currently making the decisions under the planning system that impact on all of those really important matters that you just presented, and GLAC's vision for the area within which the LAUC is responsible?
With great difficulty. So, at the moment, because we have statutory cultural custodianship over 6 LGAs, we are able to cross cadastral boundaries. So what we find is the LGAs are confined to certain areas. Then, of course, legislation limits state officials as well. So rangers will only work within a certain area to a certain cadastral boundary when we have needs beyond those boundaries. To communicate with them takes setting up a meeting, going to meet each individual stakeholder, government stakeholder in each of the 6 LGAs, which takes time, and explaining our case and trying to get buy-in to support our climate change program, which basically benefits us all and should be a state concern as well as an LGA concern as well. So we find the fragmentation within LGAs and then between LGAs a massive problem. The issues come from multi-LGAs. For instance, our climate change program, this expanding land at Heathcote, we've got 1,161 hectares, and with claiming Crown lands, we plan to zone it all as C2 land. It's a massive carbon sequestration sink. However, the dumping that threatens these TECs, threatened ecological communities, comes from multiple LGAs. However, Sutherland Shire Council is lumped with the problem. Dealing with them, we find they don't have enough resources. Rangers can't assist us, police can't assist us. We have planned events on the website, for instance, on the internet, where up to 1,700 likes for an event on this land has been noted by rangers. We can't deal with those numbers. It's a state problem. It's not even an LGA problem.
And so with that, So your interaction then with the state government on these particular matters, do you have a similar experience with what, is that consistent with what you've just kind of answered with those across the LGAs and the local authorities?
We find state is fragmented as well.
Yep.
You've got the development side, and then you've got the environmental side. We've got agreement from the environmental side that, for instance, the Cumberland Conservation Plan is really a development plan. We've got confirmation that state is interested in koala preservation, is interested in keeping the land green. And then on the other side, development laws just bulldoze those intentions.
Can I just ask you to elaborate a little bit? I'm interested in the Cumberland Plain Conservation Plan, and I see that in your document. Your view on that, as you've just stipulated, it's a development plan. Do you not see it's a plan that will facilitate the vision that you have and that you've put forward here today?
No, it doesn't. The conservation plan, I've written a document on that already, and with my CEO's permission, I can share that as well at some stage.
If that's possible to provide that to the committee, that would be very beneficial.
Okay, I'll have to get her permission first.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
That document was never handed over purely because we can't follow up on what was listed, what was observed in that document. But basically, just to try and summarize it, green spaces are essentially just instrumental in the plan. If you look at the maps I've shown you, I've given you, the first map, for instance, will show you the extent of development. That's the sort of whitish bits. And if you look at the very thin green slivers, that's your riparian zones. Those riparian zones are way too small to manage the amount of runoff from the... It's obvious to see. I've spoken to developers about it, trying to save fragments of green spaces where water can go, gravitate to, and I've been told that my opinion was just one of many professional opinions, and based on majority, the facts I presented, I was basically outvoted. But you can see for yourself, it doesn't take a professional opinion. The thin slivers are just too small to manage the amount of runoff. The 30th of June, 2023, 374 litres of water fell in 30 minutes per hectare in Milpera. A week later, we were standing ankle deep in the water having this conversation where I was outnumbered by professionals who said that my opinion was wrong. So it's clear to see overdevelopment. It's clear to see that the creeks are way too small already to manage the land. But there are many more implications that the plan has not considered. They're called Milankovitch cycles, Enzo oscillations. It's not been considered in the plan at all. So when water is not able to infiltrate the land and fill the aquifers, Sydney is built over a massive aquifer. And if you look on the second map, you'll see the low-lying areas that will be flooded. Those are areas that will be flooded during rains, and when water levels rise. Why will water levels rise? Well, your poles basically reflect sunlight. It's called albedo, but they are diminishing. Your seas are increasing. It means it's going to absorb more carbon. This water's getting hotter. Land also is absorbing land that doesn't have vegetation on it, that has buildings and so forth. You know about the urban heat cycle, urban heat island. That's all absorption of heat. So water isn't able to infiltrate. So first of all, it's getting hotter on the surface and in the atmosphere. That's going to contribute to climate change. But water not being able to infiltrate soils because of hard surfaces and running off to the sea too fast means that they don't fill aquifers. The trees in Australia for 62 million years, they're called phreatophytes, and they basically draw up water from these aquifers. And when El Nino happens, when the water is being blown away from Australia, they draw up water from the aquifers. It then evapotranspirates, about 200 liters per tree. That forms our rain during drought periods. The inability to fill those aquifers because of hard surfaces means that during drought times we create fire weather.
And so I'll turn to my colleagues. I don't want to take all the question time, but so your view then on the Cumberland Conservation Plan is that it hasn't factored in to the extent it ought to all of these considerations. Is that correct proposition? It hasn't factored in climatic influences like the Milankovitch cycles, like the Enzo oscillations. Thank you. Colleagues?
I had a question about, you mentioned overdeveloped areas, 5 overdeveloped areas, and I'm wondering what level of development would be acceptable in those areas. Like you speak about reforesting. Is there a way to pare back the overdeveloped areas, and what does that look like?
There is. That was my suggestion. Was you've got to that somewhere. Oh, sorry, you've taken it. One of my suggestions was that blocks. So the Ebenezer Howard plan, the Garden City plan, is something to start with, which basically means you build in green belts between clusters of residential buildings. So blocks, call it blocks, and you allow for green spaces between that. That means runoff is sorted, so is the urban heat island effect also reduced. However, like you said, the 5 LGAs are already overdeveloped. So you can't have any more development.
So does that mean that you don't want to see increased density? I mean, even if it's a reduced sprawl and we're going up instead of out, you would say that that's not an optimal solution?
Well, we do understand the benefits of development, and of course it's best to go up rather than out. And if you're going to go up, the materials that you use, the walls and roofs, you've got to try and create garden roofs just to reduce, plants basically reduce ground temperatures by 7 degrees. So that will help, but also the way runoff is structured today in stormwater drainage, it just goes into your stormwater and runs off. Instead, it should be those remaining green spaces, the water should be spread out so that it can infiltrate and fill the aquifers.
So are there good examples globally or even around Australia of towns or cities having a kind of reforesting plan that's been effective? Like when you're talking about overdevelopment, are there examples of cities that have managed to essentially recreate the opportunity for water to seep into the land and to have strong reforesting efforts?
No, not really. I haven't done a lot of research on it. I have looked for it, but nobody's really noted, even at the UN level, nobody's mentioned the Milankovitch cycles, the Enzo oscillations. Maybe it's an Australian concern purely because it hits us so hard. We get 90-degree rays because of the tilt of the Earth. So the sun here affects us very differently. So it's something we have to work on, it's something we have to figure out. But we mimic, by mimicking the natural system, you don't have to spend that much. You don't really have to force nature to grow. It does so on its own. There's nothing we really have to do. So encouraging the growth of Cumberland Plain woodland, the trees designed to actually keep us cool, is the way to start. Unfortunately, we attended a meeting on the 10th of October last year, where there's a task force basically planning to develop all of the riparian zones, those thin slivers you see. That's just a travesty. So it confuses me that state has signed treaties like Rio 92, Johannesburg 2002, and now Doha and New York, and the Paris Agreement. However, we're going to there's plans to develop the riparian zones as well. Those little slivers, I don't understand what the objective is.
What's the mechanism? Like, how do you propose that the riparian zones be expanded? I mean, they're already hemmed in by development. Are you proposing that
It's
compulsory
already
acquisition, or like how do you actually expand the riparian zones?
Right, so firstly, we've got to stop whatever development is planned in riparian zones. If you go to the last page, you'll see that the DPI guidelines to riparian management, I think that's frontier science. So we've got to stop this as well. The ecological services that riparian zones give us is not determined by a formula or the Strahler system.
Have you got a specific example of where a riparian zone is being encroached upon?
It's all over Sydney. This plan here is something that councils and environmental consultants use. It's a state tool, and it's completely wrong. It's frontier science. I don't know who came up with this, so that's got to stop immediately. The areas that are overdeveloped already, it's a sad state of affairs to say that it's gotten that far. I also don't understand how that's happened. There are very smart people in Australia. I don't know how that has happened. If climate change was the concern, if climate change was a priority, that would never have happened. But it has. So now that it's happened, the attitude is, well, it's done now, there's nothing we can do about it. Well, there's something we must do about it, purely because with poles, there's a reason why we've got a wet El Nino. It's because your cryosphere is turning into water. It's only going to increase. The water levels are going to rise. So those low-lying areas in map 2, figure 2, they will become a problem. Anything built next to a riparian zone, and if you look at your last map, you even allow for encroachment into 50%. When a flood comes through, this formula, this frontier science, it's going to backfire. Whatever's in that encroached area or beyond will not be able to cope with the rise of water.
Is this, are you referring therefore to, perhaps Mr. Diadam is getting to the concept of, are we looking at retreat like we are in areas like Lismore, where we have to actually whether it's through acquisition or buybacks or however it goes, if we are to do the right thing, is the mechanism a retreat from riparian areas through voluntary and compulsory acquisition programs? I mean, I suppose we're just kind of looking at what are the mechanisms to be able to now rectify some of the wrongs that the frontier science or just the ignorance or the errors or the incapacity to understand the system at the time. Do you know of any other mechanisms other than retreat and through acquisition?
well, the suggestion earlier on was the garden city concept, so one, that would help. And yes, that is a suggestion. However, I'm not completely across all of it. I don't know what crosses your desk. So I'm not across all of the information, and I understand that planning, we want to develop, we want to increase GDP, we want to improve, we already scored very high for the HDI, for the 2020 South Sustainability Development Report in 2020. However, we sort of failed the environmental then. We're 6 years away from the 2030 report. So I don't exactly know I don't have all the information, and I wouldn't be able to give you that answer right now. But I think, like I said earlier on, the solution going forward is to consider the factors that have not been considered before, the environmental factors, and to find those solutions.
And I think, I think it's fair to probably say, we don't expect you to have all the answers as one, but I think it's fair to say the only mechanisms that we have had presented to us already is incentive schemes to encourage different practices on currently private land, acquisition or planned retreats. I don't think we've come across anything else yet, but they seem to be the only mechanisms that we've had presented.
It would be useful if on notice you could provide us with a specific example of where you think a riparian expansion could feasible within the boundaries of the local Aboriginal Lands Council, perhaps somewhere, a specific site where you think there's been clear encroachment into the reserve zone, and where you think some action might necessarily be able to be taken to remediate that.
Well, we are trying to serve that solution. So our CEO started the Heritage Ecology and Land Management Department in 2022 and hired me for that purpose to assist with this very issue. And the existing land, the 1,161 hectares, for instance, in Sutherland, and land that we are claiming, the plan is to ensure that that land is zoned as C2. And if you look at the plan, the tri-metropolitan plan, the eventual plan, this green space lies at the heart of the entire plan. So the idea is to keep it green ad infinitum. We do have the support of the national parks and all the government agencies around in Sutherland. They try to support us. At the same time, they have to sometimes litigate us, which is a strange thing. It's like they know the dumping is not our fault. They know it's not. However, the way laws are at the moment, the landowner has to clean it up. So we've got to clean up 1,200 tons of development waste that came from the 45 years of development.
Can I just ask,
Sure.
specific? Is that in a specific spot?
Yes.
Whereabouts is that, if you can?
Right, so if you look at the first map, sort of the middle, down the bottom quarter of the page, around the middle,
Yeah.
you'll see red cadastral boundary.
Yep.
That is the land, and expanding. So we are based on the Project 20, the Crown Transfer Plan. We are hoping to claim adjacent land, so we create a continuous land space that links the Georges National Park and the Heathcote National Park. Mm-hmm. What's happening is animals, for instance, are gravitating into the green space naturally, running from surrounding development, which we're very happy about. However, they do move around on beyond our land as well. So we have a great understanding between the government agencies that own land that flank us, and we are working together. However, they also do not have the resources to manage this, to handle this 45-year development waste plan. They're just handling their BAU. So yeah, we're all in the same position. We do need state to do something about. One of the suggestions I noted was a state-managed and resourced regional campaign, a cleanup and an education plan. It's very necessary.
Thank you. I'm just curious, how many, does GLAC have outstanding land claims at the moment?
Yeah, we do, yeah.
Do you have any idea about the number of those?
No, not offhand.
Yeah.
Not offhand. But there are quite a few.
Yeah.
For instance, there's 2 crown spots, like that's within our land. Within that, you'll see the red cadastral boundaries. At the very north, there's the Sandy Point, Benedict's Sandy Point. It's licensed to a company. One of the problems is that because there's no environmental impact assessment prior to transfer, that problem will be handed over to us. So that is why I suggest that a proper environmental impact assessment is done prior to transfer, and at least 5 annual cycles of restoration is done. I am a restoration ecologist, so I understand that about 5 years should give a good guide on whether the ecological integrity has been restored. Then we have the Cronulla Aero Club, which is sort of little square cut out along Heathcote Road. That's also leased out. We also have a claim on that. The idea is to restore all of that, to increase the carbon sink. And that's about the best solution we can give at this stage. It's just we do need support. Help us to help you. Help us to help you, basically.
Yeah, we heard some really compelling evidence from further south from a land council that was specifically talking about with the land claims, more work really needs to be done before those, as those claims are being processed and passed through the system, whether it is ecological assessments and whether it's appropriate lands for housing, and to really identify those issues early on to assist, rather than just drop it all on the land council to have to do that work. Is that you're suggesting that in relation to the environmental impacts and the environmental requirements for the management of the lands?
Yeah, well, our plans are not to develop that at all. Our plans are to probably in small areas maybe create eco dwellings in future. But there's a more pressing concern, and that is the RFS needs tract development in these green spaces. The problem is we can't do any tract development around more than 120 tons of asbestos and other toxic waste.
And can I just clarify, around that Sandy Point area, is dumping still occurring there?
Every day.
Every day.
To give you an example, between the 1st of July and the 19th of July 2023, 87 tons of waste was dumped on one of the 22 tracks.
And they're all like bike tracks, that kind of
That's
area.
the beginning of the problem.
Yeah.
Bikers it's called track metamorphosis. It starts with bikers, extreme bikers, then it goes to extreme 4x4s, flattens it enough until dumpers, axles can handle the substrate. And we've got 22 illegal entrances along Heathcote Road.
22?
22. The other entrances are better managed because the land flanks onto Southern Shireland, Heathcote National Park, and so forth.
Yeah.
So they have ranges dedicated to protecting that. We don't have that. That's why I suggest that national assets be protected on Australian soils. National assets including vegetation, waterways, anthropology, not just but everyone's anthropology, stories. The way development works, there are no anthropological studies done. So in other words, you move, in fact it's legal to move the artifacts, but you find 40 artifacts in an area, and there's a story behind that. It is removed, you eventually kill the story. Imagine if we moved Stonehenge.
What
It was in
is,
the way.
you mentioned anthropological assessments as one of your suggestions. What does that assessment look like? Like, are there examples of those around the world, or how do you make an assessment of like anthropological value? Or
So you'll find heritage values, you'd find artifacts and so forth, but the story in Australia, the story just isn't important. If that story is not important, then neither of our stories are important. So there's just nothing. There's just nothing at the moment. Stories are dead. For a storytelling people, the story is very important. It's just as important as finding the artifact. So how does that benefit climate change? Well, the moment we find something like that, it's a long process to try and make that a place of significance. But we can, through cultural, we signed UNDRIP in 2009, I think it was. So LELCs can protect green spaces using this anthropological avenue, because the moment it's a place of significance, it cannot be developed, which means it becomes a carbon sink. And Aboriginal people, their culture, every traditional people around the world, everywhere, including us, come from a traditional background. We've just been too far removed from ours. English people are actually Brigantes. Well, some of them are. But they would carry the Brigantes traditional bloodline. In the same way, traditional people here are connected to the land. The land shapes your way of life. In fact, it shapes our way of life today. It's not such a stretch of the imagination. Australia's got a very outdoor culture. The land shapes our life in the same way it did so first for Aboriginal people. So their culture is born of the land form, the trees, the sun, all of those abiotic factors. It's born of that. To cut down trees, for instance, is to cut down their culture and to replace it with another, often a Corinthian-style building. So anthropology is a key to protecting green space.
Do we see any, do you ever see any anthropological accounts in cultural heritage assessments or surveys? Or are they is that not a theme?
No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's not a consideration. So the problem here is that developers pay for the eco-consultancy, and they also pay for the heritage consultancy. They hold the power. For them to push their development, time is money, they basically control. It's a conflict of interest, really. And that's not been picked up either. So that's one issue. And then anthropology is not even a consideration. The story of what you find is not noted anyway. In fact, archaeology, in fact, heritage, the heritage studies are development driven. If a development is not going to, if there's no development on that area, the story, the anthropology of that land is not even known. It's not funded. We don't explore enough. We don't give enough to anthropology. But this kills tourism. It kills what's the other industry? Well, future economies. So the reason I say future economies is because state does not invest in replenishment of natural capital. It's just depleted. So when you protect these areas, you are allowing nature to replenish the natural capital, like aquifers, for instance. And there's no, I don't know that, maybe someone can correct me, I'd
I
like
think
to.
the state government has recently just put forward, we have presented at this inquiry a evaluation of some of our green infrastructure and natural assets. I think we're edging that way. Whether it's quick enough or we're doing it properly, I don't know, but there's definitely, this inquiry has had the benefit of seeing some work that New South Wales Treasury is doing, which is very exciting work. Just on the, I know we're running out of time, but just on the anthropological investigation or interrogation of places, do you think that a cultural heritage assessment, or do you think there is room in the development approvals and assessment system that we should be integrating this anthropological work, because it doesn't seem to be captured anywhere else in the development assessment process?
It's vital, because we've lost too much already. Too much of the anthropology of the continent is under cement at this stage, or been destroyed or moved. It's a travesty. Each of the 7 continents are unique and they all have stories, and we're not maximizing ours, which I don't understand. But that co-creation with Aboriginal people, it's like revision history. It needs to be done properly, with not a one-sided approach. It's got to be a co-creation with Aboriginal people. And of course that has so much more value for your tourism. But beside that, the story of the people of that continent, and like everybody sitting here as well, no one has the right to destroy that, if you really think about it. No one has the right to destroy that. But it has happened. It happens with every development.
Do you have any more questions? Thank you. Do you have any final things you'd like to say? There's sort of 1 minute before we wrap up the time.
No, thank you for inviting us, and we do acknowledge the benefits of development. Don't think that we're anti-development. It's just development's got to mimic natural law. It's got to consider all of nature. It's a holistic approach, and we find that laws are fragmented. There's different definitions for heritage or for culture in just about every act and policy. There's a different definition. We've got to standardize those. So, yeah, I think the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, is what I'd say.
And so just finally, you mentioned that it's developer driven. So to rectify that, if that is the result of why we're not getting the holistic approach, is the response to that we do need a clearer regulatory approach, a framework that is largely driven by the needs of the environment, the needs of the community, and the needs of best decision making, as opposed to what I think you were suggesting, that it is developer driven. You suggested there's conflicts in there, and we're not getting the best outcomes. Am I correct in summarising?
Partially.
Yeah.
The hierarchy is wrong.
Right.
So in other words, you don't start with the development plan. You start with the environment.
Right.
You start with the people, the knowledge. Aboriginal people, for instance, their understanding of phenology is phenomenal. Phenology is basically the timing of nature, a day, a week, a month, an annual cycle. Enso, oscillations, their understanding of that. It should be a part of your information gathering before you plan. The hierarchy is all wrong. If you do not think about your environment first, so in other words, let's put it this way, the very air and water that sustains us right now to make these decisions we could destroy the source of that air and water if we're not careful. So it's got to start with nature, and nature has to be the overarching, ecology has got to be the overarching decision, influence, I should say.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming today and giving evidence and all of your time. The Secretariat will be in contact with you in relation to any questions that were taken on notice. Thank you very much.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Isn't it? We take for granted. He said he was sweating like a farm animal. He was so nervous. It's unbelievable, isn't it? Yeah. I think we need to be so much more sensitive of this. Yep. Yep.
Thanks. I'm always mindful of my like tapping away.
Okay, welcome and thank you, all of you, for making the time to give evidence today. Could I please start with each witness providing your name, your position title, and then swearing either an oath or an affirmation And we'll start with you, please.
Kelly G, Policy and Projects Officer at the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr.
Morning, I'm Nelson Nolan, Coordinator of Sustainability and Resilience at Blacktown City Council. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Kerry Robinson, OAM, Chief Executive Officer, Blacktown City Council. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Good morning, Lena Kakish, Director Planning and Compliance at Liverpool City Council. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Good morning, Mark Hannon, Manager City Planning, Liverpool City Council. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Good morning, my name's Charles Casaselli, Chief Executive Officer of the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you all of you. Would anyone like to begin by making an opening statement? Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I thank you for the opportunity to discuss the urgent need to consider climate change in our governance and planning system. I wish to begin by acknowledging the Darug people as the traditional custodians of the land on which Blacktown City is located and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Madam Chair, it's also my solemn duty to acknowledge the passing of our Mayor, Tony Bleasdale, on Friday. Tony was a great man and a great Mayor who championed the need for equity for the people of Western Sydney.
Thank you.
Blacktown is the largest city by population in New South Wales and the fourth largest in Australia. In addition to our population of 435,000 people, we have some 25,000 businesses in the city and an economy with a GRP, gross regional product, of more than $23 billion. Climate change is a dire threat to Blacktown City and all growth regions. The impacts of climate change are more significant in Western Sydney, which does not benefit from cooling summer sea breezes. Heat waves, flooding and rising temperatures adversely affect our communities and strain our budgets, with increasing maintenance costs and increased demand for services. Our community faces an average $85 million in annual costs due to climate shocks, the costs of which are predicted to triple by 2060. The Committee for Sydney's Burning Money report, recently released, underscores this, estimating household cooling costs in Western Sydney will increase by a staggering 370% over that same time period. This demonstrates the urgent need for both climate mitigation and adaptation strategies to protect our communities and councils' budgets. It is one of the reasons we support mandatory climate-related financial disclosure for local governments. Blacktown City Council is committed to action. We've declared a climate emergency and since 2022 have been carbon neutral as defined by the current Commonwealth scheme, of which I'll have more to say later. We've secured 100% renewable electricity for our operations, replaced gas-fired boilers in our pools, installed the largest behind-the-meter solar array in local government in Australia, replaced more than 35,000 streetlights with LED luminaires, and planted thousands of trees in direct response to heat challenges of Western Sydney. I strongly support the changes flagged by the Commonwealth to the measurement of carbon by the inclusion of embodied carbon. It is nonsensical for a council, or indeed for any organisation, to be able to declare itself carbon neutral while simply ignoring the carbon embodied in the concrete it pours, the bitumen it lays and the buildings it builds. However, this change will impose a significant additional cost on local government, whether for the higher cost of higher performance materials or through the consumption of additional offsets, which have a very rapidly escalating international cost. And yet local governments lack resources and planning powers to do the right thing. Rate caps and shrinking federal assistance grants in metropolitan areas year by year reduce our operating budget on a per head of population basis. Rates are our largest source of operating revenue. Calculation of the rate peg makes no allowance for the cost of improving our environmental performance, such as the need to electrify our fleet of over 1,000 vehicles and items of plant. The rate peg makes no allowance for the increased renewal and maintenance costs which come from council-installed solar systems, more efficient and thus more expensive air conditioning plant and the like. The rate peg makes no allowance for the need to plant millions of trees across our city to mitigate urban heat. And the rate peg makes no allowance for increased operating costs of cool refuges to support our most economically challenged members in the community. We know that we need to support state and Commonwealth policies, but we need the funds to act responsibly to do that, to act in line with the community's increasing expectations of all levels of government. Under the New South Wales Government's urban planning policies and controls, we expect our population to increase to about 600,000 by 2041. That increase in population is bigger than the population of the vast majority of councils in the state. And every additional resident and every additional business further erodes our ability to do the right thing for our environment because of the way the rate structure is in place. The majority of new development will bypass council through complying development pathways. We support the delivery of more homes, but without addressing climate change, we'll deliver houses that put residents at risk and shift the burden of higher energy bills and health costs onto communities and agencies. Further, the Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure's planning controls for release areas do not allow enough space to plant decent street trees, which can help mitigate urban heat island effects through shading pavements. And IPART does not allow sufficient levies on developers to allow the planting of sufficient trees to address urban heat. The New South Wales planning system must evolve. We need a new climate change object in the EPNA Act and a climate change SEP. There must be climate considerations in strategic planning at all levels, with more funding and guidance for local governments. Environmental impact statements must be required to include assessment of climate impact. And we need to incorporate heat considerations into all development pathways, especially exempt and complying development, with an update to basics, with projected future climate conditions, rather than reliance on an average of past and therefore cooler climate conditions. And we need to set clear thermal safety standards in our buildings. Constant budget cuts, ongoing cost shifting from state to local government, and declining federal assistance grants all restrict our responses. The state must either remove rate caps to empower communities or provide the direct funding for the climate action that the community needs and which its policies require. Further, the state government's highest priority must be to reverse the plainly stupid policy decision to prohibit the levying of developers to provide community infrastructure buildings, facilities which very directly aid the community in dealing with climate change. For those not familiar, we are unable to levy developers for things such as pools, or libraries, or community centres, each of which can act as heat refuges in our communities. In Blacktown City Council's case, that unfunded liability to deliver those facilities as the Department of Planning mandated when it planned the release areas is an unfunded liability of some $630 million. Blacktown City Council stands ready to lead. As Council's representative, I sit on the Steering Committee for Resilience Sydney and I chair the Greater Sydney Heat Task Force, about which Mr Casaselli will speak more shortly. Blacktown City Council takes its leadership role very seriously. Yet plans without funded actions are hollow. We need a robust legislative and financial framework to ensure the safety, sustainability and prosperity of our community and the entire state. Committee members, I'll be pleased to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Was there any other opening statement to be made? Yes, thank you.
No, I'll only do it on the basis that I have regional representation, so we'll be speaking outside of the local government perspective.
Certainly.
That might make of additional value. So thanks very much, Madam Chair and the committee, for this opportunity to present to the committee a regional perspective on some of our climate challenges. Our submission really concentrated on urban and extreme heat events, and the reason we concentrated on that is that with Resilience Sydney, WESROC chairs the Greater Sydney Heat Task Force. But in addressing the heat challenge, we're actually addressing resilience across a number of hazards that our communities are exposed. So the lessons that we've learned are learning, in fact, when we deal with extreme heat wave events and the urban heat island effect, actually impacts all the hazards that our communities face. For over 7 years, WESROC has worked closely with leading researchers, state and federal agencies and the development sector on the issue of heat resilience, which demands our attention in a changing climate. I know this has been said 1,000 times, and I'm not sure whether people are actually listening to this or not, but heat kills more Australians than fire, flood and storms combined, but receives far less attention than its more visually dramatic cousins like flooding and bushfires. Apparently they make far more newsworthy content on the evening news than heat does. While heat's impacts are largely invisible, they are significant, threatening the reliability of essential infrastructure, impacting community well-being, slashing economic productivity and threatening the natural environment. Despite wide acknowledgement that heat is a significant climate risk, there is currently no heat-related guidance in the New South Wales planning framework, except in a small number of council planning instruments. This has got to be addressed urgently. The rapid rate of urban development across our city, and Western Sydney in particular, creates significant opportunities for heat-resilient design, but the window for action is closing rapidly. WESROC has identified a clear pathway for addressing heat in the planning system. We make a series of recommendations. We need to set a clear direction by specifically addressing climate change in legislation and regulation, and Kerry spoke about that a little bit earlier. We need to ensure that large-scale projects and state-significant developments consider climate early in design. We need to ensure all planning pathways consistently address heat, and we know there are more than just one planning pathway through local government. And we must establish home and building standards that contribute to keeping people safe now and in the future. All of these actions are needed to manage the heat impacts from climate change. Our current reliance on council development control plans to address this issue is ineffective because DCPs are not legal instruments. They just don't hold up in court without high-level policies in place. And the majority of Western Sydney development is approved through state pathways like exempt and complying development, SEPs. It's interesting, Kelly, who's the person, the brains behind the outfit, had a quick look to see how much development actually comes through council pathways and non-council pathways. The reality is up to 75% of approvals go outside of the council pathways. I think the lowest council is about 35%, the highest is about 75%. The majority of councils sit between 60 and 68% of planning approvals sit outside of local government's control. Councils are also unable to set requirements that exceed state planning instruments, only by exception, for example, basics. Finally, as a regional representative, I would like to highlight that many councils you will hear from during this inquiry have done some outstanding work. Many of these exemplars have been achieved because the resourcing, the capacity and the social licence to try something new existed within those councils before the challenge came along, or before the challenge was identified. The councils that are not represented in this inquiry, the smaller ones, those with fewer resources or that have other priorities because the community deemed it to be, have an even greater need for state level support. And they're the ones that really need the state government to resource them appropriately, but also provide some leadership in this particular issue. I'm a fan of not delegating leadership. And I'm not a fan of the state government saying 133 councils, you've got a problem, go off and deal with it on your own. You've got 133 councils that are providing services, and one simple instrument at the state government could save a lot of work across 133 councils across the state. Was it 128 councils? I might have that number wrong. So we call on this committee to support those councils in addressing those issues, because if we do not, our communities will pay. They will pay with detrimental impacts of their health, with costs of living and quality of life. These risks will not be equally distributed. Western Sydney residents already pay 100% more for their energy needs to ensure they have appropriate air conditioning in place during the warmer months. We could see the emergence of climate ghettos where some homes are unaffordable and are unsafe during extreme heat and heatwave events. Wesrock is currently leading a Greater Sydney Heat Task Force comprised of federal, state and local governments, as well as industry and the community sector. This task force has been established because its members see the urgent need to address the issue of heat, knowing the major impacts it will have on their budgets, their work and their communities. Every member of that task force has identified the critical role that planning must play in mitigating and adapting to climate-exacerbated heat. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all from the outset for your submissions. They're incredibly helpful. We'll have some questions. Can I just start, though, by with one about 75% being outside of council control? Are we looking at, and you mentioned exemption complying, Seb, is it also the case that we're looking at planning panels, or how does that, is that a component of why these matters and development decisions are outside of council's control?
The planning panels would deal with the vast majority of the 25% to which Charles refers. The 75% is private certification, largely of cottages.
Thank you. And can I just ask, on the ones that are in the 25%, does council see that the planning panels are delivering good outcomes in terms of having council control through that lens of council being able to control some of these outcomes for better development that is climate resilient or heat? Is that system within council's control still delivering good outcomes, or not necessarily? Yeah, please.
I'll start off by mentioning I'm recovering from surgery, so I'm sorry about the voice. It'll croak up and down, but I think the microphone will help me.
Yeah.
Just on the planning panels, I think they have the same predicament that the council has in terms of being restricted in what to consider under the planning framework. So the planning panels and council staff would seek to make decisions that would address climate change and these issues more stringently. We are, however, bound by the fact that, as Charles and Kerry mentioned, the planning framework itself does not address within the legislative documents some of the issues. And so when we understand, and the panels understand, that pushing the hard line on the DCP control when the objectives are still being met means that we most likely will not be successful in an appeal, Class 1 appeal. As an example, we feel that our hands are tied in pushing the line in that respect. So it does come back down to the fact that the planning framework needs to be more legislated in terms of those key controls to address climate change and looking at sustainability in the way that we would want to see outcomes being achieved. Also, just on the earlier question with the 25%, we still don't have complete control over some of those developments because, as an example, large-scale subdivisions may come through council or the panel, but a big component of those dwellings may still go through CDC. So we're still not controlling the entire outcome of development in some cases, particularly with respect to greenfield subdivisions.
Madam Chair, my councillors would certainly say that the planning powers should never have been taken away from councillors. Their view is very much that councillors are elected to represent the community and make decisions on behalf of the community, and those powers, those planning powers, ought to be returned to councillors for that very reason.
And so, just on that, and I have not had the opportunity to look at every single council's DCP. I've obviously glimpsed at ones when they've come across as certain issues, but would it be your proposition that councils, when you were referring to the exemplars and the work that council can do, the DCPs, to the best extent they are able to, encapsulates that more visionary planning, but it's limited, is what you're saying, and you can't actually enforce what's in the DCP, its recommendation, and even at the outset, is it the proposition a DCP can only be made as long as it's not inconsistent with an LEP or a SEP? Is that the case?
Largely it is. I think the issue is that we try and deal with issues within local government at the lowest level, because we, representing local government, we can actually affect and develop DCPs. But the issue is this: why should a DCP have to deal with an issue which has everything to do with the minimum size of a local road, for example? So the road reserve of a local road may or may not give you an opportunity to have a footpath and a tree planted on the same side of the road so people can actually walk in shade. There is no minimum standard of a local road in New South Wales, yet councils are expected to deal with this issue of no minimum standard for a local road to give effect to, say, to have a tree canopy cover and a footpath on the side of the road, when really the state just needs to have one instrument that simply says the minimum standard of the road reserve for a local road will be X, and that takes into account a footpath and a tree on the same side of the road. The issue of not having this minimum standard means that councils are running around and trying to deal with, okay, that doesn't exist, but how do we sort of influence developers that when they do their layouts, they actually have minimum road reserve that allows those things to happen? And I think that plays out time and time again. We're asking councils to do things at too low a level in the hierarchy of instruments, when a single statement from a high level instrument fixes it for all 128 councils in the state. So why do we need to do things in DCP so it can be easily done with that state instrument? I think that's an issue. And there's a number of those sorts of issues.
So is that like a template document that councils would amend to suit their areas, or it's just something that sits above everything else?
It can't be a template document. We've got too much, we've got too many guidelines in local government that can't be enforced when there is a contentiousness between a developer or landowner and local government. A simple statement in high level instruments means you don't have to go to court 1,000 times a year over the same sort of issue. So it's not a template. It's simply a simple statement that says the minimum road reserve size of local road New South Wales will be X. There's no argument, folks. Go out and plan your master plan communities based on that. And that means we can actually get garbage trucks and fire appliances to deal with fires at people's homes down the street. And we are, at the moment, the state is actually approving developments where it's physically impossible to get a full-size garbage truck down the road. And that's happening today. And let me tell you, it is at local government that's actually approving those developments.
And is those... sorry, please go ahead.
Ms Chair, if I could perhaps help Ms Munro. The development industry would certainly suggest, Ms Munro, that cars don't change shape when they go across local government boundaries, and therefore different standards aren't required. If I could come back to the question of development controls, particularly for growth councils, which are accommodating most of the residential growth across the city. In the case of Blacktown, the answer to the question is in two parts. There is a development control plan which council is in control of, which relates to those areas outside of the growth areas. There is a separate suite of development controls comprised of a SEP and a DCP, which relate to the growth areas. Those growth area controls are controlled by the Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure. The outcomes that are being delivered through those controls are poor, to say the most. And I have dragged out to our growth areas, Lucy Turnbull, Jeff Roberts, anyone from the Department of Planning who will listen, Abby Goldberg, former commissioners, to show them the outcomes which are being delivered, which is effectively two-storey dwellings which occupy the whole of the lot, bar 900 millimetres off each side boundary, 3 metres off the back and 3.5 metres off the front boundary. There is no one who's going to plant a 10-metre high eucalypt in a 3-metre wide courtyard at the rear of a cottage. And so Our view is that we need space within the public domain for tree planting to aid in urban cooling. But as Charles has said, the width of the roads don't allow that. Now, we have requested that the Department of Planning sensibly re-look at its controls for those growth areas, and for more than a decade it has resisted such change. The controls that apply to the release areas presume a much lesser density of development than has actually occurred, and the consequence of that is that there are numerous services which are deficient in terms of capacity, including roads, utility services, and the form of development has much less green space than was contemplated when the plans were done. There needs to be a sensible re-look at those suite of planning controls which are governing the vast majority of new cottage development across the city.
Can I just, oh, sorry, my colleagues, I often look at the questions.
Just on that issue, so what can be done to remediate those areas, those new developments that are obviously contributing to the heat island effect? What kind of measures can be taken if you're saying that there's no capacity to plant trees, there's no capacity on private land, there's no capacity on public land? What's the solution for those communities?
The first thing we can do is amend the planning control so that we don't keep doing the wrong thing as we are doing at the moment. For those existing areas, and there are challenges in retrofitting new planning controls in subdivision areas where the roads have already been built and so forth, we can do more in terms of delivering street trees which provide shading to road pavements. There is a challenge of trying to do that in pavement because as lot sizes have shrunk in order to deliver higher densities, the availability of on-street parking becomes very precious to those communities, and quite frankly people resist street trees in road pavements and will actually damage them. Trees are the best thing that we can do. Insertion of additional water within the urban environment is important in mitigating effects. We can increase the reflectivity of the roofs of dwellings. We can look at thermal mass and how that absorbs heat within the urban environment. There's a range of things that we can do. But for that stock of housing which has been built, it has an economic life and it's going to be there as is.
So I did a knockdown rebuild. I was required to plant a tree outside the front of my house as a condition of the approval. Why isn't that requirement imposed on developers? Why aren't they obliged to provide the street trees as part of the overall planning of the estate?
You can do that. There's a question of whether the tree will survive. So if you're from a culture which doesn't value trees, or you don't like trees, or you don't like leaves, or you don't like sticks, or you don't like insects, and I get correspondence to councillors about those things every single day, there's a great propensity to chop down any trees.
Also, on that, it's about, for example, looking at planning controls to retain significant canopies. When you've got thousands of houses within a precinct with freshly planted trees, they're all small trees, there's no existing significant canopy. Where I've seen in a lot of cases, some of the trees can be retained. They can sit in a certain part of the subdivision that is not necessary to be removed to yield the amount that's expected. So a fresh precinct with just baby trees means that there's going to be a number of years before significant shading can be provided. Also on your point about what can be done, even with something like your darker colours and finishes, so government working with industry to incentivise the supply of lighter roof tiles and colours and other finishes for dwellings, and building that also into the CDC framework to mandate lighter roofs, lighter finishes. If you're, I'm sure Blacktown is the same, but if you're driving through Liverpool, you will see an array of dark roofs. So it's about working with industry as well, looking at what can be supplied and how we can incentivise those types of changes to the built outcomes?
There's the Greater Sydney Heat Task Force will be coming up with a series of recommendations very soon. That will also include recommendations to reform the policy agenda, so it's looking at the highest level, but it'll come out with some very practical measures for the city to take in dealing with the heat challenge. So there's that aspect of it. But there's also a tool called Cool Suburbs, developed largely by local government. There is no longer a case where anyone can stand up and say, we're ignorant of all the things that we can actually do to address this. The research is in, the considerations have been done, the analyses have been completed. We now have a tool that actually allows you to measure the impact of all the different mitigation measures, thermal mass of buildings, the colour you use, the orientation of the building, a whole range of things from master plan precinct level right down to individual dwellings. That tool's been developed for Western Sydney. Industry's looking at it, has been playing with it, and that's being expanded to be a tool at a statewide level, and I think the Commonwealth may want to even take it to a national level as well. So in terms of what can be done, there is no shortage of information about the things we can do today.
Can I ask when you're expected that report would be concluded?
Kelly?
The 30th of September is when, because it's state grant funded, so that's when the program will come to a close.
And the report will come out of that? Is that?
It will.
Yeah.
So at the moment, there's already currently a report for the Western Sydney portion of that tool, but the statewide version of that tool will be available from the end of September.
So you're talking about the tool, the outcome of the Greater Sydney Heat Task Force?
I'm talking about the outcome of the greater... Yeah, sorry.
Same date.
Okay.
Make it easy, yeah.
All right. Can I just ask you about... I think there was the SEP that was proposed and repealed. The
Design and Place
Design and Place SEP. Sorry, it slipped my mind.
Yeah.
Is that something... Can you comment on that?
My staff loved the Design and Place SEP.
Right.
They made major contributions into different aspects of it. And we saw it as a way of dealing with a lot of the problems that were before us. Personally, I'm not a fan of bringing something new when something that exists today is broken. I like fixing things that are broken rather than bringing something that's new. But the Design and Place SEP dealt with issues, and I think our staff put forward a series of recommendations which were model clauses you could include in Design and Place SEP to deal with the climate change impacts across our communities. I'm not sure of the additional stuff that was in it, but in terms of the climate change stuff, it actually provided a solution to many of the issues that we spoke about here.
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. In terms of the Design and Place, Liverpool City Council are very supportive of the reforms, and similar to what Charles and Kerry have talked about, a lot of the design elements to consider climate change, the heat island effect, greening, tree canopy, that was covered in different coloured, lighter coloured materials, that was covered in the SEP, and it was quite disappointing, I think, from a council perspective that was disbanded wasn't progressed by the form of government.
Could I ask, just in the West Rock submission, you talk about disaster designation for heat waves. How do you see that actually working in practice?
Kelly, can I get you to respond to that, please?
Sure. So that speaking to a state level, so as the CEO of Blacktown's already mentioned, a lot of councils are working on programs like cool refuges and places for people to go during these extreme events when they can't stay safe at home for whatever reason. For other hazards, those disaster arrangements cover things like the additional staffing required to manage some of the impacts of those hazards during the declaration of that hazard. At the moment, heatwave is not considered a designated hazard under that framework. So therefore, even if a heatwave disaster was declared, there's no promise that there will be any kind of compensation or support for councils or others at the local level who may need to activate certain spaces in that case.
So in a flood or a fire, you have a recovery centre set up.
Yes.
And you're saying that that attracts Commonwealth or state funding. But that's generally set up by a state agency, isn't it? So you're saying that in heat waves, the councils would be looking for funding through disaster funding.
And I might pass that to Blacktown, who's done the most work in that space, if that's okay.
So, Mr. Adam, the challenge that we have is in respect of a heat wave, there's not a designated organisation which takes a lead in coordinating agencies, councils, the community in terms of a response. I think theoretically it's meant to be the Department of Health, but let's face it, the Department of Health has probably more important things structurally to do than that. So part of the challenge is who will actually coordinate state responses, each of the agencies' contributions to ensure that the community is looked after and the vulnerable people in the community are protected. There's a presumption perhaps that local government knows who lives in its LGAs and magically local government will be able to seek out those that are in need. Local government does not. Local government knows who ratepayers are. Local government knows the registered address of those ratepayers. They don't know whether those ratepayers live in the city, and they certainly don't know who the tenants of dwellings are, and they certainly have no information in respect of the health status or vulnerability of those individuals. So it can't be local government. There does need to be a coordinating agency. There needs to be an analysis of what that coordinating agency needs to know and how that knowledge is then applied to mitigate the impacts that Kelly and Charles have spoken of, which are very significant in terms of human health.
There's following representations from Wesrock, the Minister agreed to review the heatwave subplan for the state, because that heatwave subplan, unlike any other plan in the emergency management arrangements, didn't deal with the continuum of emergency management in terms of prevention, preparation, response and recovery. It only looked at a very narrow slice, which was, damn, there's a heat wave, what are the messages that we're going to get out? So there was no one looked at the roles and responsibilities across the public sector. It certainly didn't look at what local government could do, should do, and in dealing with that. So I think in June, the government has put together a workshop for local government to actually give its input to a document that has a significant impact on how it operates during heat waves in New South Wales.
What constitutes a heat wave? Is it just one day, or is there a definition that kind of...
So for the professionals, there is actually a definition that says 3 or 4 days of above this certain temperature. For people in our community, any day which is really, really hot, and any number of days that are really, really hot constitutes a heat wave that the agency should be looking at on my behalf.
Mr. Nolan wanted to say something.
Yeah, sure. So Blacktown City Council operates cooling refuges for residents, and so in our policies we have defined threshold for when we open, and that's according to BOM's own heatwave declarations, and so they have low intensity and then high intensity heatwave declarations. So we open on high intensity heatwave declarations. But again, as a council with limited resources, limited staff in particular, it's really hard for us without the guidance of, like, let's say a heatwave subplan, which has clear instructions for the different kinds of responding agencies. It's really hard for us to open those cool centres and be responsible and then liable as well for the well-being of residents.
Do you open them in 24 hours?
Yeah. Go on, and then I've got Mr. Ruddock and Ms. Munro.
I'm just curious about the kind of the service delivery response, what that actually looks like. Is it 24 hours, so that people can go there during the night if it's...
That's right. So we work closely with community partners, and so it's usually only during business hours, so from 11 till 5 p.m. And that only really captures a portion of when residents are most at risk, which is really from that 3 p.m. into the evening. And that's just because Western Sydney, it has so much concrete and asphalt that we absorb the heat throughout the day, and it stays really hot into the evening. And that's when we're really worried about residents, especially those that are elderly or have health conditions. Is when it gets to 9 or 10 p.m. at night, it's still over 35, and they haven't had any relief throughout the day.
And I will just point out that there are some community challenges in operating those centres. Local councils don't know who declared persons are. Local councils don't know who former convicted felons are. So there is the potential for us to be bringing together children, declared persons and so forth, which has a series of risks, many of which we can't actually mitigate. So systematically, there needs to be work done on the design of that system if it is to be expanded.
I might also add, because I think we've received a lot of inquiries recently about listings for Western Sydney school shelters, that Blacktown has really gone out and piloted this type of approach to see what could work, but just to reiterate, this is not a common approach across local government or Western Sydney. Blacktown was fortunate enough to receive funding to pilot this approach and are rolling that out as a way of understanding how these types of measures might be done, but there is currently no formal guidance or requirement to do that, and it's not a common thing across our city, but it is something that I guess communities are increasingly calling for and interested in as things become unmanageable in their own homes.
And we're not able to do that in release areas because we don't have the funding to build the community centres to accommodate those functions.
And that goes to your point of we should stop doing the things wrong at this point and then work out how we go back and fix the things that we, Mr Ruddock has...
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Mr Casacelli. Thank you for your submission on behalf of Wesrock. I'd like to quote from it. You do get straight into it. You say, the current terms of references omit inclusion of extreme heat. Given the severity and scale of potential impacts of extreme heat on our community's economy and environment, we urge the committee to ensure extreme heat is included in the inquiry. And then you say, heat kills more Australians than fire, floods and storms combined. Now, that is true. I agree with that. And you did bemoan in your opening statement that there's all this attention, media attention on these other things. But the Lancet, which is the world's most respected medical journal, they did a big international study recently, and they found that for every one Australian that dies of heat, 12 die of being too cold. Now, it does get bitterly cold here in the western suburbs in winter, and we often have snow in the Blue Mountains not too far away. So if it's a 12-to-1 death ratio of cold to heat, and this is something that's seen all around the world, which is why people want to live near where it is warm, are we sure we're not misdirecting a lot of resources and we're focusing on the wrong thing here?
If you increase resilience to heat, don't you also increase resilience to cold?
No.
I mean, if I'm actually building a room, if I'm building a house and there is a mandate that says at least one room of that house must be survivable when you get extreme heat events outside, there's a temperature differential between ambient outside and inside the house. If you're going to keep a one room of the house safe for human beings, that is, you increase the insulation so that whatever it is outside, you're actually maintaining a level of ambient temperature which is conducive to human health. Well, it doesn't matter if it's really cold or really hot outside. The fact that you've got a highly insulated room which is cocooned and is guaranteed to allow you to survive would, in my estimation, would actually increase your resilience to cold as well. Except instead of spending energy on an air conditioner giving you heat, you spend energy on an air conditioner giving you cold. I don't see...
Well, I think a 12-to-1 fatality ratio is something that should be of, for policymakers, should be a very high concern, and it's something that you bemoan being people concerned about fads. This is a fad. And now I have one more question, Chair, to I think it's to Kelly G. You've mentioned about these heat shelters that the council has constructed. So I mean, I think it's probably just part of the hysteria, trying to whip people up that there's this impending crisis about heat. But what's been the take-up rate? How many people, we've just come through summer, how many people turned up to these heat shelters?
So I'll pass to Blacktown for that, but just the buildings that are being used, they are not constructed buildings, they're existing buildings like churches and community centres that are being repurposed during hot weather.
That's right. So normally we operate out of libraries and places that people feel comfortable coming to, or that provide other community services like childcare, that sort of thing. And so it really varies on the day, but where we have the most people coming is actually in our growth area. So places like Riverstone, that experience a rapid increase in development. And so we'll get anywhere from 15 to 20 people come throughout the day. And we found it to be a fantastic way for our community to connect, not only with Riverstone resources from a community perspective, but also council resources. So we can provide additional resources around services that council provides when people come to visit our cool centres.
Thank you. We are running out of time. In fact, we're over time, but I know Ms Munro is bursting with a last one.
Just one question, and it's probably relevant to all organisations, around the kind of data that you would like to see provided by the state government to assist, whether it's through basics or SEPs or any programs that you're running that would benefit from more detailed or more up-to-date or more comprehensive data, and what that data is?
In relation to the work of the Heat Task Force, one of the members is the Bureau of Meteorology, and it is doing great work in getting very, very fine-grained climate data and small regional areas down to, I think the latest set of data was 4 kilometre squares, grids. So I think the data in relation to climate from BOM is good, and they are doing work to further improve that granularity.
Mm-hmm. So nothing from the state government that... Mr. Nolan?
Yeah, so NARCLIM data is very good. So I think NARCLIM 2.0 data will be...
What's NARCLIM?
This is National and Regional New South Wales climate change data. And that gets really down to the granular level. And so what that allows a council to do is to look at things like flooding and heat and storms, and then really plan for them based on our understanding of how those hazards will impact our assets. And also kind of cost out the potential impact. So the State Disaster Mitigation Plan did a fantastic job of that, but that was at a much higher level. So as a council, when we're doing our long-range planning, financial planning, having really granular data through NARCLIM.
So is that happening already?
It's something that's happening already, but what we're lacking is then kind of the legislative frameworks to back up action. So for example, the state government has recently passed the Climate Change and Net Zero Features Act. Something like that for climate change adaptation would be incredibly instrumental, followed up by state SEPs, and then guidance for strategic planning and that sort of thing.
At the moment, obviously, with the state's disaster mitigation plan, and now the intention that we get regional, local adaptation plans. Some of the inquiry input we had was, well, that's all great, but without the regulation or the directives to implement these things, local government will still be left treading water in various places, etc. Would you agree with? Is that, you're all nodding your heads? Is that
absolutely?
Yeah.
Local government is funded to do what it did last year. It's not funded to do new things. The rate peg doesn't take into account the increased expectation of the community for an increase in service delivery. If you ask us to do new things, we won't do them for want of budget.
So I actually have a fear, born of experience, that local government is still today being asked to do stuff that is better addressed at higher levels of government. You know, even as late as last week, when I had a look at the State Disaster Mitigation Plan and its flow-on effects to local government having to develop adaptation plans at the lowest level, my question was, well, what if there's a common hazard across multiple LGAs that affect whole regions, perhaps a whole city? Why would you want an individual government going off doing its own adaptation plans? Wouldn't it make actual sense to have an overriding adaptation plan with some annexes that give you some place-based nuances from one local government area to another? Now, I thought that was a reasonable request. I still haven't got an answer on that, but I think the same issue is playing out multiple times, which is someone in the state government can do things a whole lot easier than local government needs to do it. And that State Disaster Mitigation Plan, going down to local-based adaptation plans, I think that's a boundary that needs a better look, if you like, to make sure that local government is not necessarily doing too much work to get the same sort of outcomes.
I think the issue has also been that the goalposts have shifted over the last few years with ownership and control of flood planning. So for Liverpool, we are stuck between planning proposals whereby the policy on evacuation and emergency response is unclear, and I understand the government's working through that, but clarity around evacuation, for example, is an issue. Ownership and control of flood planning, that messaging has changed. initially through Reconstruction New South Wales, it was that they would take on the responsibility, and then that messaging has also shifted since the initial inception.
As in, it's back now on local government to do
what's
flood
unclear.
planning and modelling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the current messaging.
Yeah.
We've got LGAs with, most of our LGA for Liverpool has very outdated flood planning maps. We've got areas around South Creek and the airport that where the flood planning has its own complexities. So we've really got to get on with it and understand, with the severity of the task ahead, how we can move forward with updating our flood maps, and also understanding what the unified position is on development and flooding. We recently had a proposal for Liverpool Private Hospital where the planning proposal was stalled by the department because the PMF became the issue, not what we've known to be the flood planning issue. So some clarity and consistency moving forward to help us to plan in our flood-prone areas.
Perhaps, could I make
Yes.
a question for the committee to ask the government?
Yes.
Question would be,
I've got a list of
why
those.
is local government being asked to do the disaster adaptation plans as a consequence of the state disaster mitigation plan?
It's not clear.
Why aren't they going to the local emergency management committees?
Yeah.
I mean, that in my mind is why the LMCs exist, but why are they going outside those channels to go straight to local government to do something that those local emergency management committees should be doing? Because if they're not, what else are they doing? That would be a good question.
I mean, I think some of the examples from the Northern Rivers, where we had the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporation and the council engagement with those LGAs that were impacted, I think some of I'm not answering for the government, obviously, but some of those lessons, as a Lismore community member, some of those lessons were actually councils were best placed and had best knowledge. But as I'm hearing resoundingly, without the money and the funding and the resources, it's not going to happen, and it's not going to be done well if it is happening.
Oh, it'll happen, because local government makes it happen, but is it the optimum outcome for the efforts expended?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important point. I feel like we could probably talk till 9 o'clock tonight. You've been incredibly generous with your time, and your evidence has been really very helpful. The Secretariat would be in contact if anything was taken on notice. So thank you all very much. We've come to the end of the session.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We went over. Sorry. Maybe 11:50. We only need a couple of minutes. 11:50. 11:50. Yep. Sorry about that. You're all right. Okay, thank you and welcome back. Could we please start by each of you stating your name, position, title and then swearing either an oath or an affirmation. And Councillor Gould, we'll start with you if that's okay.
Matt Gould, Mayor of Wallandilly Shire. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given to me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Jamie Erkin, Manager Statutory Planning at Camden Council. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Nicole McGurran, I'm the Director of Planning and Environment at Camden Council, and I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Would either of you, any of you like to make an opening statement?
Thank you. Firstly, I just wanted to thank the committee for inviting us to present today and also for acknowledging Camden's council's submission. So from council perspective, we certainly support the inquiry and the intent. So, and the reason for that is obviously flooding is a very topical issue in Camden in the last few years. In 2022, our community was significantly impacted by four floods. It had significant impacts on our community, public infrastructure, private buildings, homes, and of course our residents. So if any of you know Camden, so the historic township of Camden, which was built around the 1850s and 60s, a beautiful historic town. It's located within the Nepean River floodplain. So the clean-up and the cost for us from those floods was significant. We had some three bridges. One of them we shared with our friends at Wallandilly that required significant rebuilding and repair. There was also a lot of erosion along our riverbanks. Some of the work in terms of the rectification and repair work is in fact still underway. So, but I guess the true cost of a lot of this is around the impact for private businesses in the town. And also for residential properties. So it's been enormous in terms of the financial and the emotional costs on the local community when these events happen, which is very unfortunate. And for council, it's very resource intense in terms of the recovery. There's obviously opportunity cost there for a lot of work that can't be done when we're undertaking the recovery work. Which just leads us to the issue in terms of how we manage these properties in particular going forward. Properties that we now know that from what we know now, we probably should not have had development on them. We've got updated flood studies and risk management policies. Once those studies are done and they identify properties that are flood affected, they have significant negative impact on the developer land, and which also reduces the development rights. And we're dealing with residents now who have been impacted by that. So, and whilst we can plan for development and address flooding in newer areas, it's more challenging for us in areas, our older areas such as Camden Town Centre, and that's where for us a proposal such as a buyback scheme for those properties that are most impacted would be most beneficial. Lesser properties can obviously benefit from initiatives such as house raising initiatives, and council's currently considering whether or not that could be possible on some of our properties in Camden, and we're undertaking some consultation with our community. We were discussing around we recognise the funds required for a buyback scheme. We know Camden's not the only area that would be that is impacted by flooding, and we were thinking that it would be good in terms of we need to think for innovative ways where we can support properties that are impacted, and that may be ways such as transferable development rights or incentives, which would still allow most impacted properties to be acquired and potentially their development rights transferred into another area. Camden is a growth area, and we're undergoing a lot of change. We're one of the fastest growing LGAs, if not the fastest in the country. So, and with that, if it's okay with the inquiry, Jamie, my colleague here, was just going to present just some of our ideas in terms of tackling some of these issues in our growth areas.
Thank you, yes.
Yeah, just briefly, as Nicole touched on, in the new release areas, flooding can be managed because they are obviously the newer areas, but in those areas it's probably urban heat that's the biggest concern. And a lot of that, in terms of potential planning reforms, relates around the code set. You've probably heard from other people as well on this, but currently the exempting applying development code has very limited design controls that prioritise sustainable building, and so roof colour, pavement colour. The controls have limited rear and front setbacks, so there's limited deep soil planting and trees. Given the small size of properties we're talking now, of 200 or 300 square metres, it's actually really hard even to get street trees out in the street. So trying to have some controls in the code set would help. It would also ensure that councils' local controls for DAs aren't out of step and there's not an equity issue. In Camden, I'd probably suggest the majority of housing is via complying development certificate. If councils have their own urban heat controls, the odd house where it's a DA will be held against that higher standard, but then the neighbours obviously have the lower standard in the code set. So that's probably one of the planning reforms that could be looked at. Urban sprawl is a bit more difficult. We love to encourage diversity in Camden. Unfortunately, current market conditions mean it's really hard to get that higher density development, such as flat buildings. So at the moment, we're dealing with block sizes that are getting smaller and smaller, which is simply a reflection of affordability. I think you'd be looking at average lot sizes these days in the circa 300 to 400 square metres, and some are obviously smaller than that as well, which obviously makes it difficult to provide trees, particularly on private properties. In terms of innovative incentives, sustainable building design can be expensive or more expensive. Obviously, over the life of the building, there are savings, but it can be an impost for people, particularly building in areas such as Camden. So whether or not there can be some sort of incentives or awards for people exploring more sustainable building designs, that's something that we've also recommended in the submission. But yeah, thank you.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you very much for your time today and for listening to the challenges that we're facing. A little bit of background to Wallandilly. We're the very outer fringes of Greater Sydney. We kind of have a foot in regional New South Wales, a foot in Greater Sydney, and the challenges that we face are a little bit of both. So my shire is 2,560 square kilometres, and of that, approximately 85% of it has been classified as bushfire-prone land in the latest updated mapping that has been done. We have a long history of significant fire impacts, particularly on our urban fringe, and we're seeing the intensity and frequency of those sadly increasing. If we look to the 2019-2020 fire season, we were very, very lucky within Wallandilly that we didn't end up with a mass casualty event, because we had traffic that was backed up for kilometres and kilometres on Remembrance Drive, unable to get out. And if it wasn't for the fact that the wind changed, we would have had a whole heap of people trapped in their cars. Now, the reasons for that are severalfold. Firstly, the infrastructure has just not kept pace with the growth that we have seen in Wallandilly. And secondly, there is, I think, a lot of work that needs to be done in the space of the cumulative impacts on bushfire planning. So often when we're looking at bushfire planning, they look at the initial development that has been put forward, and the planning for bushfire protection provisions look at how to make sure that those people can get out and get to a main link road. What isn't looked at is the cumulative impact of when you've got that and the development next door and entire villages. In the case of Wallandilly, if you've got a catastrophic fire danger day and we have the advice of, you know, everybody needs to leave if you're in a bushfire-prone area, that is entire villages for us. And if you're going somewhere safe, you're looking at going to to Narellan or Campbelltown or Penrith, where we're talking thousands and thousands of people seeking to relocate, and we simply do not have the infrastructure to do that in a timely way. When we have fires, people unfortunately have a tendency to not leave until really it's a little bit later than they should, and we get the problems that we saw in the 2019-2020 season, where they're trying to get out and the infrastructure just cannot support getting them out in a timely manner. So I think that one thing that does need to be really looked at within the planning system is how those risks at a cumulative scale are assessed and measured and mitigated, because at the moment there is a very clear gap that we have there. My shire is also very flood prone. I think we're up to our fifth disaster declaration in the last 4 or 5 years. We have acute flooding issues within Picton in the CBD, and to be frank, you would not build a village in Picton where it is now if we were working from a greenfields site. This is a bit of a historic issue that we need to address, but there is a lot of challenges that need to be addressed there as far as the flooding and how that is managed. Elsewhere within the Shire, we have approximately, on the flood work that we're doing at the moment, 1 in 3 of our lots are flood affected. And similar to bushfire, whilst we look at the detail of a specific lot, the cumulative impact and what that means is not well looked at. It is not uncommon for our communities to, maybe their property themselves are not flood affected, but they become flood islands, they are cut off, and are then a whole heap of work for our emergency services to try to get people out before they get cut off and to properly manage. And once again, that cumulative impact is not looked at in an effective way. The entire north of Wallandilly, during any major flood event, will be cut off and will be isolated because the bridges that connect us to Greater Sydney all get cut off across the Nepean. And it is not uncommon for the entire north of the Shire to have to either funnel their way down through Picton, which gets flooded itself, or to be entirely isolated. If you were looking at an area like Warragamba or Silverdale, whilst Warragamba and Silverdale themselves don't flood, they can become isolated for a number of days. And the detour for them when it is open, you are looking at best, a 2.5 hour detour to get around on roads that are not designed to be taking bulk traffic. So I think we really do need to be looking at the broader challenges that come with the cumulative moving of a large number of people. One of the other emerging issues we are really seeing, and my colleagues from Camden sort of touched on it, is this urban heat island effect. So Wallandilly has 2 state-mandated growth areas, and in those state-mandated growth areas we see a very different style of development to elsewhere in the Shire. We know that the urban heat island effect can cause temperatures to increase by 10 degrees higher than they would otherwise be. And we have put an awful lot of effort into trying to mitigate that in the early planning stages, and we have, through a lot of work, been able to get a 40% tree canopy target for Wilton. But one of the challenges that we're seeing is that the lots are so small that they often can't put trees in there, and so we're having to try to put them as street tree plantings, and the effectiveness of that is challenging, to say the least. I think that there is a lot of work that needs to be done when we're looking at how we address that urban heat island effect, where at the moment you get the biodiversity offset for a block of land, and that's all that's considered, and they can then clear every tree that is there. Consideration of the value of those mature trees to help mitigate the heat island effect is not considered within the planning framework at the moment, and I think that is something that really needs to be looked at, because those mature trees take decades to get to the point where they are, and at the moment we're just seeing them be completely cut down indiscriminately. Finally, I guess, and it's an issue specifically for us when we're trying to balance some of the challenges, Wallandilly is also home to a large amount of threatened species, be they koalas or otherwise threatened ecological communities. Often where we're seeing the growth, that there's kind of the interface between those 2 areas, and it's a real challenge and a real balancing act trying to how we protect those communities but then also try to mitigate the bushfire risk and the other risks that come from having those areas in close proximity. And I think there is a lot of work that can still be done in that space too. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll just ask questions if that's okay. Thank you very much for those. Is it possible, do you have copies of your opening statement? Is that something that you could provide to the Secretariat before you leave? That would be very helpful if that's possible. Or now? Yeah. Can I just ask, just going to one point you said, Mr. Erkin, earlier about new release areas or new development, that flooding can be managed.
Yes.
Can I just ask, are you currently working with existing flooding models and policy, or have you also been required to adjust that to be factoring in probable maximum floods?
Yeah, as planning proposals generally these days need probable maximum floods dealt with as part of the planning proposal process.
Mm-hmm.
So in Camden, it's the older areas in Camden near the Nepean River that are flood affected. In the new release areas, through the precinct planning process, flooding is addressed at the rezoning stage, which means that typically the residential lots are above the 1% with freeboard, and then you deal with issues such as safe evacuation access.
Yeah. Okay. And are you satisfied with the current data that you have available?
Council does quite a bit of modelling. We've recently done some up at South Creek and Nepean flood modelling as well, and so Council is comfortable with the modelling that we've done today.
Thank you. Yeah, we just had different views of different councils about where they're at, and it sounds like the greater the flooding challenges, the less reliable the data is. It's a consistent thing.
Yeah, I would say, look, I'm not in the flooding engineering section. We've done quite a bit of work. The work, as I think is touched on in our submission, is quite resource intensive, and so, and obviously things move quickly, so I suppose it's hard for a local government to be completely up to date with the flooding information they have, just because they are such large projects and they run over such a long period of time. So
just with Wallandilly, is that something, are you satisfied, and is your staff satisfied with the current data and modelling on flooding that you have, or is it something that is an area that you're struggling with as a council?
Look, it's an area I think that we are struggling with. We are doing a lot of work at the moment ourselves on trying to properly map the flood risk in Wallandilly, and that hasn't been done on a systemic level for our Shire before. We do think that there is a requirement for the undertaking of an updated and detailed flood analysis that incorporates the most recent climate change projections prior to the granting of approvals. And one of the challenges we also see at times is, I guess, this sort of zombie DA issue where you may have something that was approved 10, 15 years ago that has been sitting there and hasn't necessarily been assessed against modern standards, and then the impact of that.
So that is an issue for you and your LGAs, the zombie. We've heard a lot about zombie DAs, but we understand now they're very broadly characterised. They can manifest in many different kind of versions, but that is something that you have that's coming up for you as a council.
Very much, particularly in the bushfire risk management space, of trying to address that when a rezoning may have been granted with a DA 15, 20 years ago in some cases, and it's just sat there for whatever reason. When it then comes forward, it's got the DA consent so long as they've put pegs out at some point, and there's not much that can be done about it at that point, unfortunately, and it's a real issue in some of our villages.
Right. Does Camden have this similar experience? Is that...
we would have some approvals that have been issued that haven't been enacted that wouldn't be to the current, our current standards in terms of flood risk management.
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. My question was around the growth areas, particularly for Wallandilly. You've identified in your submission Wilton and Greater Macarthur, and also noted that those areas might not actually be suitable for growth given they are wildlife corridors and they have some ecological value. Are there alternative options for growth areas or ways that your council has identified to mitigate the impact of population growth in those areas?
Look, I think that's a very real concern, and if you look to us for our growth areas, that's a tripling of our population at Wilton and at Appin. One of the big challenges that we are facing with the whole process is we're not contiguous with Sydney, so all of the infrastructure that is required needs to be put in from scratch, and to be frank, we're not seeing sufficient infrastructure investment to provide for what is needed for one growth area, yet alone now having two growth areas that are competing for that same pool of funding. That causes a huge range of issues, but particularly within the scope of, I guess, the planning system and emergency evacuation. If you look at somewhere like Appin, for instance, the data there says that in the event that we had to evacuate that entire area, we'd be looking at something like 11 hours, which is woefully inadequate. Now, whilst that will gradually change as the area grows and there will become a threshold point where it can become a safer area in and of itself, we've got significant concerns around the transition of how we make sure that happens and how we make sure that there is, one, sufficient firefighting water, and two, sufficient road links, so that if we do see fires, and Appin does have a long history of fire, that we can make sure that the community is safe not only at the end point when it's all developed, but throughout that process. And because we're looking at having wildlife corridors throughout that Appin growth area, those corridors are critically important, and I think we need to be doing more to protect them. But the fact is they also act as avenues for which fire can get into and impact on these communities, and trying to make sure that those two things are balanced, I think is a great challenge, and one of many concerns that Council has in that space.
Would you say that it is preferable at the moment to increase density in existing towns, or that there is an appetite to spread those growth areas more broadly, not necessarily like an urban sprawl, but increase medium density in more places, or have a higher density in a few places?
I think broadly, increasing density in areas that already have access to the infrastructure is the smart thing to do. I do think that, though, that can't come at the expense of where the government have already made commitments. So Wilton is occurring. Whether we like it or not, the state government has made that decision, and Wilton is going to go ahead. We need to make sure that it gets sufficient investment and gets the infrastructure that it needs to make that area work. That said, the position of my council is very clearly that Wollondilly's growth should be focused at Wilton, and we don't want to see large-scale growth elsewhere within the Shire, because we see the benefit in focusing that growth within one area, particularly when we have all of our villages that have all of these various exposures and a complete lack of infrastructure to support any large-scale growth. So I think it's a case of correcting, like Wilton is happening, we need to deal with that fact, but if we're moving forward in how growth should happen, putting it out on the very outer fringes of Sydney where there is no existing infrastructure is not a recipe for success, in my view.
So you would suggest that other local government areas are better equipped to take the density and population growth?
Absolutely. I think all councils need to do their bit. I think Wollondilly, we have 12,000 lots that have been rezoned at Wilton. We're happy for that to be our contribution to addressing the housing challenge, but we need to see the investment in the infrastructure to support that, and that should be where our growth is, rather than having all of these small-scale hit-and-miss things all over the place that diverts the effort and the energy of our staff and of the infrastructure agencies from actually being able to focus in and deliver somewhere where it can be done in a meaningful way.
Okay, and a question for both councils. Do you have an understanding of, in terms of the zoning that you've got at the moment, and also development applications that have been approved, so two different data points, do you have an understanding of the potential dwelling capacity in terms of the zoning that you've got now? That's the first question. And if you do, and you don't know an exact figure or range, could you take that on notice, please?
We could certainly take it on notice, but every new precinct that has dwelling targets and an expectation of what the density will be.
Yep.
The actual figure doesn't always match the predicted once it's developed, but yeah, every new release area has a predicted population.
So for us at Wilton, there's a target of 15,000, of which 12,000 have been rezoned. For Appin, it's a total of 19,000, of which 12,900 have been rezoned.
Okay. All right, that's good. Thank you.
And could I just add, so at Camden Council, we're currently considering planning proposals under assessment. So I think we have 6, which would deliver over 20,000 houses, dwellings, including Leppington Town Centre, which has got a capacity for over 11,000 dwellings just in the town centre. But I guess to Mayor Gould's point, Leppington has a train station. So.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Can I just ask you about koalas and the developments? Do you think that at this point in time the state government's initiatives the state government is providing you with what you need to look after the state's koalas or that population, those populations of koalas in your local government area? Or does something need to change in the planning system that could help you better protect koalas? Where are we looking? Given the upper house inquiry found that koalas are likely to be extinct by 2050 unless we do a lot differently to protect them. I'm just curious about. I feel like you're sitting on a front line there.
Look, I think more needs to be done, both in terms of protection of the habitat, but critically the movement corridors and making sure that they are of sufficient width. There is a lot of toing and froing on the benefits of the koala fencing, and on a day-to-day basis the koala fencing is very useful to helping minimise road strikes and the like, and dogs getting in. Unfortunately though, the evidence would suggest that when you do get a fire in there, that the fencing then becomes a little bit of a death trap for them. So it's important that we have not only the koala fencing, but the overpasses, underpasses, the movement corridors within them, so that they can actually move around safely, and when there is things like fire, that they have the opportunity to be able to relocate, because otherwise we're going to try to save them and end up killing them en masse because we haven't given them places to move when we do get fires. Wallandilly has been trying to finalise our own koala plan of management for several years now, and we haven't been able to because the guidelines from the state government haven't been finalised. That's an issue that we've raised with the Minister recently, and were given an undertaking that it would be addressed. But we really do think that there's need for a revised planning system to reflect the finding of the statutory reviews of the Biodiversity Conservation Act. And I do think that the committee should consider and provide recommendations to address shortcomings in the planning framework in so much as it relates to biodiversity loss based on all of the available information, and that it looks at the biodiversity management document, including inconsistencies on the sections around koala corridors and the advice from the chief scientists and engineers. So making sure that we get those minimum widths for those corridors as recommended by the chief scientist.
Thank you. Do you have questions?
Oh yeah, I wanted to ask, so perhaps you could unpack this for me. So you've spoken about declining block sizes and the consequential impact that has in terms of having trees on private property. I think you said you had 12,000 blocks rezoned. Firstly, what's the mechanism in terms of how block sizes are regulated? That's not a council thing for new developments, is that right? It's done at a state level through the Department of Planning?
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, look, in the growth area, we have a state policy that dictates controls. Typically, you have minimum density in certain zones, and there's also a minimum block size. So those two controls together dictate what the ultimate block sizes are. 300 square metres is sort of the mapped minimum block size, and so that's like, I'd say the average block size these days would be in that sort of 300 to 400 square metre
And
mark.
does that policy also fix the amount of hard surfaces on the proportion of the block that can be covered by hard surfaces?
Councils have controls primarily in the DCP for dictating the hard surfaces, landscaped areas, and then the code set, which is a state policy, has controls for complying development, and sometimes the controls in the code set might be out of step with what councils are trying to achieve in their DCP in terms of landscaped area or site coverage.
So in the case of, say, the 12,000 blocks that have been rezoned in your municipality, Mayor Gould, what can be done to I suppose, retroactively address this question?
So in our case, our LEP and our DCP apply for most of the Shire, but within our 2 growth areas, because they're state-led areas, they have their own planning framework, and a lot of them are, Wilton in particular, they've used urban development zoning, which is very, very flexible as to the outcomes, and as my colleague said, it looks at density. We have fought really hard in the neighbourhood plans for Wilton to make sure that the DCP controls there have a higher tree canopy cover, and the goal that was agreed is a 40% cover. What we are finding though is, in reality, seeing that being delivered is problematic when you have lots that are so small that they have no capacity to actually have a tree on the block, because the block is the size of a postage stamp. So we've been doing a lot of work in street trees and trying to make sure that's addressed. And also we've been doing a lot with water sensitive urban design to try to get these corridors where we can have trees. But I think that there needs to be some more work done in these lots to make sure that, that the lots are at least big enough to have a small or medium tree in them to help address this, because we know that the tree canopy is one of the biggest things we can do to mitigate the urban heat island effect. And at the moment, it doesn't feel like it is given the same importance as things like bushfire risk and flooding risk is, and it is probably the biggest emerging challenge that we have in these growth areas.
One of the issues, I think, with planting trees on private property is the impact of roots, and I'm aware that in some circumstances the warranty on your slab is actually contingent on distance, that you can plant a tree close to. What can we do to address that disincentive to people planting on private property?
I think it's difficult with obviously the lot sizes and the setbacks. As I mentioned before, under a complying development certificate, you only require a 3 metre rear setback from your boundary for the smaller lots. Obviously, when you've got a 3 metre deep backyard and a courtyard that's 25-30 square metres, it's very difficult to plant a tree in such small backyards. Similarly, the front setback is also 3 metres with an articulation zone for other building elements, which really makes it difficult to plant trees. So
how do you address that? I mean, with the lot sizes?
There are technical solutions that can be used. So for a lot of our street trees in these areas, for instance, you put them in root boxes that direct the roots in certain directions. Things like that could be looked at for private holdings, but I think part of the thing that we need to look at is, if we're going to be having these lots that are so small, then we need wider setbacks at some point so that we can actually accommodate trees, and how we protect the existing trees that are there. One of the things that we're seeing happening when we're trying to get this 40% coverage is putting 100 trees in one corner and then go, well, technically we've met the tree coverage. That doesn't actually achieve the objective that we're seeking, because it's about having the shade and having the coverage throughout the site. So we need to be planning these new communities in ways that actually does allow for a reasonable level of tree planting, be that a combination of large street trees, but then also shrubs and smaller trees within the blocks. Because if we don't achieve something there, then this urban heat island problem is just going to get progressively worse.
So we're basically hard baking into the system treeless blocks. Effectively, you can't have trees on a whole range, whole swathes of suburbs because of the block size in the subdivision.
Yeah, that's correct. And then it's compounded, like I mentioned before, by the fact there's no controls around roof colour or pavement colour, which is then adds to the urban heat.
Can I just ask you on that? Did you have? I asked the councils before, but did you have any view on the design, place and design SEP?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that was an initiative of the state government that has no longer been pursued, but obviously that was looking to have controls that sort of add to that. So, I don't have a policy position on, but obviously it was looking to value add in that regard, which would have been a good thing.
And so with these things that you're finding, so just from a mechanics perspective or an operational, as councils, is it, are SEPs a good way to deliver these controls that mean that you're not then imposing them yourself and you're facing standoffs in the Land and Environment Court, or the planning panels are SEPs, and do you have a view on other mechanisms, or have you got a secretly preferred, desirable, best mechanism to achieve these things?
Look, I think SEPs are good because it gives consistency then across the board. As I said, the issue you can have, councils can have local controls, but then if the SEP doesn't follow the local controls, then they're out of step. And as I mentioned before, the majority of housing in Camden would be approved under state policies.
Yeah.
So if we change local controls, that might affect some of the housing, say 20%, but then the other 80% are governed by the state controls. So I think to make sure local controls aren't out of step with state controls, a SEP is a good mechanism.
And when you say that, you're referring to mostly exempt and complying and private certifier, that's where most of them, the bulk.
That's correct. Complying developments and exempt development, having complying development under the code SEP, that's correct.
Yeah,
I think SEPs have their place, and I agree with my colleagues from Camden. One of the challenges you have is where there are multiple pathways. So, developers will take whatever gives them the outcome they are seeking. So you can often get very different design outcomes, and I don't think that is desirable. But I think it is a balance between having local provisions that address the local needs and having broader regional approaches. One of the challenges that we often see with SEPs is they seem to lag a lot more than controls that local government will put in. So we may identify, for instance, the need for street trees and we make those changes, but then to get something like that implemented broadly across a SEP, it takes a very, very, very long time. So I guess if we're going to be looking at a more SEP-oriented solution, it's how do we make sure that they are being responsive, or do we look at a system where SEPs set a baseline, but then they also have to comply with whatever the additional DCP or LEP conditions of that council are? So is that do you think? So your view then is giving a DCP a bit more power and a bit more muscle. Is that what you're suggesting there in your desired approach to get these very important outcomes on the ground? Yes, I think so. I think if we have SEPs that cover the baseline, but still allow councils to be able to be flexible to their local needs, and that you have a provision where those specific council needs have to be addressed even if they go down the SEP line, would be advantageous, because at the moment they'll quite often take the SEP, which then lets them just skirt around anything the council has put in, and that to me seems to be where the challenge is, where we want something that is actually consistent across the local government area. And to achieve that, then to make a DCP more enforceable, it would need to be provided not simply in the LEP, it would have to be either a SEP that prescribes the DCP is enforceable, or within the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act itself. Is that your understanding of the mechanisms? Yeah, that's correct. The Act would have to be really changed, because at the moment a DCP must be completely consistent with the higher policies. Yes. And so, exactly right. Yeah. Thank you. We've come to the end of our session. Do anybody have any further questions? Do you? No. Are there any final things you'd like to say?
I was just going to add in terms of examples, so I agree if we had in the SEP some local controls that are mandatory that councils could add. If I think about some of our early growth areas in Camden, so Camden's been a growth area since 2006 was declared, but some of our suburbs which are really green and produce really nice outcomes, they were prior to the code SEP, so it was through the DCP, but in addition to that, the actual developer themselves had design guidelines that if you purchased into that subdivision, into that suburb, you had to also meet their design guidelines. So some of our leafier and I guess much nicer suburbs to now go and visit, where we've been some 20 years along, where we've got some lovely established trees and streetscapes. They've been in suburbs where a developer suite of guidelines, design guidelines, have supplemented the council's DCP controls. And they've historically worked really well, but of course now the code SEP would override the DCP and those guidelines.
And so then, so are you suggesting there, I mean, I suppose it sounds trite, but if a developer's not required to do something, they're not going to do it. It's that kind of...
Actually, I'm suggesting the contrary. I'm suggesting that we've been fortunate, and even now in some of our newer precincts, we work hard with developers, and they want established street trees. They want them retained.
So how is the code SEP? How are you suggesting that's now circumventing that initiative?
Because now that doesn't mean, it doesn't commit people to comply with the DCP or those, legally they're guidelines that developer had placed on when they were selling the lots. But people now, I guess, are aware in terms of the code SEP is also going to be a cheaper opportunity for them to, or avenue for them to go down, so they'll
so they don't have to do... Yeah, I see. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your time and coming today and giving evidence. If you did take anything on notice, the Secretariat will be in touch with you about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much for coming today and giving time to provide evidence to the inquiry here. Could I please get you to start by stating your name, your position, and then swearing either an oath or an affirmation? And Ms. Chandra will start with you. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Shalja Chandra. I come from Sweltering Cities, and my role is Multicultural Senior Campaign Manager. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm Sana Shah. I'm Sweltering City's Western Sydney community campaigner. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you both very much. Do either of you have an opening statement you'd like to make?
Yeah, I have an opening statement.
Fabulous, thank you.
Sweltering Cities is a health NGO that works directly with communities impacted by extreme heat to advocate for more livable, equitable and sustainable homes and cities. In the last 4 years, we have engaged in thousands of discussions with affected communities, such as those living in Western Sydney, that are disproportionately burdened by extreme heat. This region holds higher risk factors, including age, disability and socioeconomic status, and also environmental and geographical factors that make it up to 10 degrees hotter than surrounding rural areas or cooler coastal suburbs. Heat waves are already Australia's deadliest environmental disaster, and these existing vulnerabilities in some of the state's frontline communities will result in increases in heat-related illness and mortality, as multiple recent Australian-based studies show. We are therefore advocating for easily solvable measures that will make their homes and neighbourhoods more livable and equitable. We urge that the New South Wales Government set a localised equity-focused tree canopy target that will increase the green cover in hot suburbs where it is needed the most, and not an overall target for the entire city. This is a seemingly simple request that people across Western Sydney express to us when we ask them what measures could be taken to make their suburbs safe during heat waves. Some of the hot suburbs we work with are also rapidly growing, with thousands of new homes and infrastructure projects planned in the coming years. We think there are significant opportunities to change how planning and housing regulations are approached, which would lead to lasting benefits for its residents in the future and also align with the net zero goal that the government has set out. This is crucial as climate change is expected to exacerbate extreme heat, making it more frequent, intense and prolonged in the Western Sydney region. To this end, we are advocating for energy efficiency standards and tools to utilise current and future climate data. Our recent report revealed that currently the planning system uses climate data from 1990 to 2015, which excludes the 9 hottest years on record. We should not be building for a climate that no longer exists. Last week, Sweltering Cities also released the Hot Roofs report, which found that dark roofs compound the urban heat island by making the temperature of the local area increase by up to 7 degrees hotter. We recommend that the New South Wales Government prioritise updating the basics regulations to ensure that individuals, builders or developers using any method of certification cannot design new homes in Sydney that have dark roofs. Any new black roofs are inconsistent with the goal of cooling the city, preventing heat deaths or transitioning rapidly to a clean energy future. We are advocating for simple, cost-effective reforms that will future-proof homes and suburbs disproportionately affected by extreme heat. All of these reforms are supported by community members across the state who are worried about the impacts of climate change and want to see better planned cities. It is now time for the state government to invest in and create urban infrastructure that keeps our communities safe during heat waves and other climate change impacts now and into the future.
Thank you. We'll just ask some questions, if that's okay. Thank you very much for your submission as well. It's very, very helpful. I note just one point about that is where you refer to the Western Sydney Airport in particular as a development that you say will increase heat, or I think it's fairly uncontested it will increase heat. Could you share your experience? Have you tried to influence the outcome around that? Are you doing that as an organisation or an advocacy group? And what does that look like?
So, not necessarily the airport. I don't recall doing an inquiry or a submission to for the airport, but we have been working with the communities very, very closely, and it's and also, of course, advocating all the aspects related to the suburbs that surround the airport. But working with the community also allows us to encourage them to also be the voice of their concerns. And so we take our advocacy and also working with the clients, communities through our heat forums quite seriously. And we believe that by upskilling them in terms of their own voice also will contribute to heat-safe cities and suburbs.
Thank you. I understand that now. That makes a lot of sense. And just so, in relation to the changes to the planning standards, can you explain what the experience, the community that you're hearing that they have, where they are trying... It seems like, and we've heard from other witnesses today, we all know what we need to do as a minimum. What are the things and what is the experience as to why we're not doing that?
So our summer survey report is where we are listening to the communities and hearing a lot from them. So we've got lots of stats that my colleague Sana will talk about. But in terms of just planning regulations, there are two asks that we present today. So one is about the hot roofs, which comes up very regularly in our summer surveys as one of the measures that community would like to change, where they can have the options to pick a lighter color. And that's one of the easiest and very simple measure. And the other thing that, the other ask that we propose today is looking at future-proofing our planning, our energy efficiency standards, in particular the NATAs and similar standards, also the National Construction Code, which requires the minimum energy section J. And as Sana mentioned in her opening statement, that currently those tools recall and work on climate data, which is from 1990s to 2015, which excludes 9 hottest years on record, and those intensity, duration, and frequency of extreme heat is only going to increase in the coming decades. So we've just done a report where we require those data to be updated. This is something which is perhaps the people who are affected and living in hot homes do not directly understand the impacts of some of these measures, and some of these measures also apply to new buildings. So we are advocating for this, for the growth areas, particularly where we are looking at thousands of new homes to be built in the coming decades, and those people living in those homes will have benefits from these revised or updated climate data to our energy efficient standards in the coming 30 to 50 years. But in terms of existing homes and people living in existing stock of our cities, we are looking at hot roofs in particular and advocacy around hot roofs. And so through our summer survey, there are many mentions of that, as I mentioned, but also our recent report is being discussed quite widely currently. We just released this last week, and there have been a lot of response.
This is the it's 10 degrees, the experiment that involved the experiment and the 10 degrees hotter. I saw that in the media last week.
Right, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So in terms of, I'll throw open, I won't take all the questions, but in terms of the, so new roofs, just focusing on the roofs for a moment, new roofs, do you think from what you see, is it your view that we should literally only be allowing people now to invest in those lighter roofs and the what's defined as a cooler roof? And then with the older roofs, what are some of your suggestions around what we do?
So with the existing roofs, of course, it becomes slightly more challenging than the new roofs, but there are still retrofitting options that are available to those who may be going through a retrofit cycle. There might be a maintenance coming up where they maybe are having a certain budget which could be put into retrofitting. So we suggest, of course, if there is enough budget, replacing the roof to a lighter color, but if that's not a possibility, there are some cool paints available which have worked quite effectively as well, which reflect a certain amount of heat But then there are also other more simpler ways to achieve a cooler roof cavity temperature, and that includes a whirlybird, for example, or some other ways of ventilating the roof cavity. And also putting some extra insulation or sarking, that's also something that can be simply done. So those are some of the things we are suggesting. And of course, there are always, the tree cover argument that, but that can take a decade before our roofs can be covered by a good big tree.
Is there, have you had any input or suggestion about whether there could be an investment scheme or an optional scheme that lower income earners could access funds to be able to make those retrofits? Is that something you've looked at or considered?
There are a number of existing retrofit funding opportunities, but we'll take that question on notice as to whether or not they are available to residents and whether they have to keep track of the benefits or carbon emission reductions or other benefits in record for them to be able to avail those funding or not.
And just finally from me, can I ask, with your, I think it was a report that you released.
Yes.
Are you able to provide a copy of that to this inquiry? Thank you.
Yeah.
As I said, the Secretary will be in contact about that. Do you have questions?
Yes. Thank you for coming in today. Now, I'm looking at your website. The opening line is, heat waves are Australia's deadliest environmental disaster and cause more deaths than all other disasters combined. Now, with respect, I'm sorry that you are misleading the public. The Lancet, the most respected medical journal in the world, has found that for every one person that dies of heat-related causes in Australia, 12 die of cold. It does get very cold here in the western suburbs. We have snow nearby. Now, this report says that that death rate from dying of cold in Australia is twice as high as what it is in Sweden, because we've built our houses though we're preparing for our hot summers, but we're neglecting our very, very cold winters. So if it's a 12-to-1 fatality ratio, I know it's not a trendy subject, but this is the reality. And I do think that you are misleading people and saying that we're having this massive spiral of death because of heat. What I'd be keen to see what your response is to that.
I would love to be directed to the study that you're referring to, because we obviously Australia, it's a large country. Places in Victoria get very cold. We know that. We're not, none of our reforms or asks that we put forward today are not meant to be generalisable. But especially, in Western Sydney, I think it'd be very hard to find studies that will show in the coming years climate change is going to make Western Sydney cooler rather than hotter. So again, a lot of our advocacy is focused on the future, on future speculation about what might happen to the climate. Yeah,
there's evidence of record hot temperatures, as I mentioned. That since 2015, we've had 9 hottest summers on record.
Well, I dispute that. But we've still got a 12-to-1. I mean, you've asked me for I'll very happily send you the Lancet report, but everybody in the world knows that the cold is far more deadly than the hot. That's not something that we need to do a lot of research into. I know it's not the trendy subject, but I would encourage you, your Sweltering Cities thing, which has been around for a few years. I'm not sure where you get your funding from, but we want to be based on empirical reality, and we want to care about those people that are dying. It does get very, very cold here and in the mountains in the middle of winter.
Of course. Could I also ask what year your study is from, that Lancet paper?
2015.
2015. Perfect. So a recent 2023 study by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare shows that extreme heat was the largest contributor to any extreme weather-related injuries and mortalities. Also in that 2015 paper, I'd just like to confirm that it is definitely Australia-based and not getting data from other countries.
No, it was a worldwide study. They included 15 countries, and one of those countries was Australia.
Yeah, so the studies we refer to are Australian-based. And we're an Australian-focused advocacy group. We're not, it gets cold in Europe. We're not interested in that. We're interested in Australia and in Western Sydney specifically.
I just wanted to just add to what Sana provided. We actually go by New South Wales State Government website. So ADAPT New South Wales lists out all the heat wave related facts, and I can read out from the website where it is mentioned that for Australia, heat wave is the biggest natural disaster, which kills more Australians combined than other all disasters, bushfires.
You're referring to disasters, which is sort of going to, you can say there was a disaster this week, a flood or a cyclone or something. I mean, the cold is something which is very general, but it does affect a lot of people, a lot of old people, and it does result in a lot of fatalities.
Of course. Yeah.
Do my other colleagues have any questions at this point? Can I just ask about the tree? Well, you're considering about the tree canopy and tree cover. We've heard a lot of consistent evidence that councils are really struggling to require developers to place trees because lot sizes are getting smaller and smaller. Have you heard kind of innovation or visionary solutions around what we can be doing better? Certainly we need to perhaps be amending all of these regulations that are allowing development without tree placement and adequate canopy. Are there any other things that you've heard or that you could suggest or provide to us?
There are free wilding and similar sort of innovative pocket-size innovations, but I think the biggest responsibility and onus does sit with the builders, with the developers. And we did hear from the previous inquiry that sometimes the only way to push them is to mandate some of these planning controls. But I do want to mention some of the tools that are very popular, such as the Green Building Council's Green Communities tool, Infrastructure Sustainability Council's IS tool as well, and a new rating tool that's coming up called Cool Suburbs. And so Sweltering Cities is part of the the Greater Sydney Heat Task Force. We are on the steering committee, and as part of the task force, we are looking into the development of this rating called Cool Suburbs. But again, of course, these tools are not enforced, but they do give developers an incentive because, of course, there is a direct benefit when consumer is looking, sort of shopping around for a better home or more livable home. If it is a rated tool, a 5-star rated Green Star community, they are likely to opt for those houses, but also they may pay a little bit of premium if they are convinced that this tool does bring benefits. I have known from my experience in the sustainable buildings area that developers can really package it up as a great community initiative and can sometimes ask for premium prices and come together with a win-win sort of a solution. And sometimes the innovation lies in just the way these homeland opportunities are packaged up, and there might be also innovative ideas such as equitable housing, so how they are really balancing the whole density so that all economic backgrounds can have a house in the new community. Also looking at well-being or fitness opportunities. So together, they might come up with an area where it was a wasteland, but they put in some money to make that wasteland a more sort of fertile land, and then develop houses around it which actually have a beautiful view of the wasteland, which is now actually a green pocket. So there are opportunity, innovation in the way they're pushing the thinking rather than just technological innovation.
Thank you. And what's your view in terms of any large canopy tree? Is it have we got to the point where we should be suggesting we need to retain all of them in particular areas? Is that something?
Yeah, so there are a number of great initiatives that the state government has, and I just wanted to mention them as well. So there is greener neighborhoods, so such as Greener Neighborhood Guide, the Greening Our City program, and most recently tree canopy data that's been made available from November 2023. But to your point of bigger tree cover, but we are looking at those tree covers where they are needed. So this a study that I was looking at highlights that the council that do need greatest increase in canopy area are Sydney's western and central city areas: Blacktown, Liverpool, Penrith, Campbelltown, Camden, Canterbury, Bankstown, Cumberland and Fairfield. So we believe that especially for these growth areas, there should be some minimum requirement to retain a certain percentage that meets our target of 40% citywide average, which currently is very lopsided in terms of not the tree cover not being where we truly need it, where the dark roofs are, where the dark bitumen is, and where there's very high density areas. So yeah, we would like it to be more equitable and also definitely focus on the communities which are currently suffering from the urban heat island effects.
Thank you.
So in your submission you say that every lot should have space for trees. I'm not sure whether you were here when Blacktown Council was giving its evidence, but one of the issues was just that there's in some communities a hostility to trees, and that means that even if trees are planted in the initial development, that they are neglected or damaged intentionally. What can we do, or what work are you doing around trying to shift attitudes that might support tree retention?
That's a
I think
good question.
just to start off, obviously a lot of our advocacy, we don't often gauge hostility from the community about trees. Like, one of the most popular responses that we get in our summer surveys: we need more trees where people live, Also, just previously, we were talking about the tree canopy target. We had so many people from Penrith who is doing like a pretty good offsetting tree planting scheme, but the issue is that a lot of those new trees that are planted are in like reserves that are far away. So while Penrith Council will overall have more trees, it's not where people are based. So I guess the equity focused tree canopy target that we talk about, there's varying dimensions of it. So not only in Western Sydney suburbs, but also making sure that we're not putting trees in like distant places, where people aren't, because then we're not reaping any of the benefits from shade and other,
But in terms of people's, like you said, that they sometimes intentionally may be damaging the future tree cover. I think education, of course, is a big factor there, and I've been noticing the new YIMBY effect that's taken everyone by storm, and I think slowly similar social innovation such as YIMBY may be a good example of how people's perspective about yes in my backyard would change.
Thank you. We have come to the end of our session. Is there anything final you would like to say?
No, all good.
Yeah, we're very grateful for your time and your evidence today. The Secretariat will be in touch about those couple of matters taken on notice. And thank you very much.
Thank you.